I never thought much about the woman who lived next door, at least not until that evening, when everything quietly shifted. She was always polite, always composed, the kind of neighbor who waved across the driveway or exchanged a short hello while collecting the mail. But that night, as I carried my groceries in, she was sitting on her porch with a book in her lap. The late summer air was warm, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the hedge between our houses. She looked up, and for the first time, she didn't just wave. She called out, her voice gentle but clear, "Would you like to come in for some tea?" I froze for a moment, surprised. It wasn't the sort of invitation neighbors often extended, especially not from someone who carried herself with such quiet grace. She was older than me. That much was obvious, but there was something about the way she spoke, a softness that made me feel like refusing would be unkind. So I nodded, setting my groceries inside and walking over. Her house felt different the moment I stepped in. Warm light spilled from a lamp in the corner, casting golden pools over her bookshelves and patterned curtains. There was a faint hum of a record player, an old jazz tune whispering in the background. It was the kind of setting that made you slow down without realizing it. She guided me toward the kitchen table, the wooden surface polished smooth with age. "I don't usually do this," she said with a small laugh, reaching for a porcelain teapot. "But it feels nice to have someone to share a pot with." Her movements were graceful, deliberate in a way that comes only from years of knowing how to carry yourself. As she poured the tea, her hand brushed against mine, just lightly, and it startled me more than it should have. Not because of the touch itself, but because of how natural it felt, like it belonged there. The steam rose between us, carrying the scent of chamomile. I wrapped my fingers around the cup, letting the warmth sink into my palms. She smiled across the table, and I noticed for the first time how her eyes softened when she was truly seen, as though a layer of formality had slipped away. We spoke of simple things at first, the weather, the neighborhood, the quiet of the evening. But even those ordinary words carried weight, because she looked at me when she spoke, really looked. Her voice had a low warmth to it, and the way she tilted her head slightly when listening made me feel like my words mattered. At some point, I caught myself thinking how rare it was to feel this at ease with someone so quickly. The distance I had always assumed was between us. The years, the walls, the quiet boundaries of being neighbors seemed to fade beneath the glow of that single lamp. And when she smiled again, it lingered, almost as if she, too, was surprised by how natural this felt. It's strange how quickly the air between two people can shift. One moment, we were neighbors making polite conversation over tea, and the next, it felt as though we had slipped into something deeper, a space where words carried more warmth than their surface meaning. She asked me about my work, not with the detached politeness people often show, but with genuine curiosity. Her questions weren't rushed, and when I answered, she listened with a stillness that made me feel seen. She tilted her chin slightly, her fingers curling around her teacup, her eyes steady on mine. It wasn't intimidating. It was grounding, like she had all the time in the world for me. I found myself laughing more than I expected. She had a dry wit, the kind that revealed itself in quick observations or playful remarks that slipped out with a subtle smile. When I teased her about the stack of novels piled unevenly on her shelf, she raised a brow and said, "Don't judge me by the mess. Those books have been better company than most people." The way she said it made me grin, but it also stirred something quieter in me, a thought I didn't want to dwell on just yet. Time moved differently in that room. The minutes seemed to stretch, filled not with silence, but with a comfortable hum, like the warmth of a fire that doesn't demand attention, yet makes its presence known. I became aware of small things. The soft clink of her teaspoon against the porcelain, the faint trace of perfume lingering when she leaned forward, the way her laugh lingered, just a note longer than necessary, before tapering into a smile. At one point, our hands ended up close on the table, not touching, but near enough that I felt the awareness of it. That small, unspoken nearness carried more tension than any deliberate gesture could have. I wondered if she felt it too, the delicate pull of something that neither of us had named. "This feels nice," she admitted quietly, her voice softer than before. Just talking. It's been a while since I've had company like this. I nodded, unsure of what to say without breaking the spell. My instinct was to reassure her, to tell her I enjoyed it too, but the words caught in my throat, and instead, I simply held her gaze a moment longer than I normally would have. She didn't look away. There was no rush to fill the space between us. We let the quiet stretch, not awkward but full, like we both understood something was unfolding and didn't want to disturb it. By the time I realized how much time had passed, the tea had cooled in our cups. Yet I didn't feel any urgency to leave. Instead, I found myself leaning in slightly, wanting to stay, to listen to her voice a little longer, to be part of the rare ease that had settled between us. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fireworks. But it was rare, and it was enough to make me certain I didn't want the evening to end just yet. There's a moment in every conversation when something changes, when it's no longer just words exchanged, but something quieter, heavier, carried in the pauses between sentences. That's what I felt sitting there across from her. She had just finished telling me about a memory from years ago, a story about traveling alone, finding herself lost in a foreign train station and laughing it off later. Her laughter now was soft, nostalgic, but I noticed something beneath it, a shadow in her eyes that didn't quite match her smile. When the laughter faded, she reached for her teacup, her hand brushing close to mine again. This time, I didn't move it away. She held the cup for a moment, then set it down slowly, her fingers lingering on the porcelain as though she wasn't ready for the silence that followed. "I haven't done this in a long time," she said finally, her voice low. "Just sat with someone. Talk like this. It feels almost strange." There was a vulnerability in her words that caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know if I should respond with reassurance or simply let her words stand. I chose the latter, not filling the silence, but giving her space. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and it struck me as such an uncharacteristic, almost shy gesture for someone who always seemed so composed. And that's when I felt it, the shift, that invisible line between neighborly politeness and something far more personal. I found myself studying her, not just her words, but the way the lamplight curved against her cheekbone, how the soft shadows played against the graceful lines of her face. She wasn't just my neighbor anymore. She was a woman sitting across from me, opening pieces of herself she hadn't shown in years. Our knees brushed under the table, a small, accidental touch, but neither of us moved away. The contact lingered, subtle but charged, like a whisper left hanging in the air. I felt the heat rise in me, not from the touch itself, but from the fact that she didn't retreat. She caught my eyes then, and for a breath too long, neither of us looked away. Her gaze was steady, searching, as though she wanted to read something in me, or perhaps was afraid I'd read too much in her. "I'm glad you came over," she said quietly, almost as if the admission surprised her. I smiled, though my chest felt too tight for words. "So am I." It was simple, but it carried more than I intended. She seemed to hear it too, because her lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes softened in a way that told me she understood. The night was no longer about tea or small talk. It had become something else, something unspoken but undeniable, a subtle shift that neither of us acknowledged aloud. Yet both of us felt deeply. And from that moment on, I knew the evening was no longer ordinary. The room had grown quieter, though nothing in it had changed. The lamp still glowed softly in the corner. The record player hummed faintly with its low jazz tune, and the untouched tea cooled between us. But something in her expression made the air feel different, heavier, more fragile. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her hand resting on the edge of the table as though she needed its steadiness. For a long moment, she said nothing, and I wondered if the evening was coming to a natural close. Then, almost as if the words slipped out before she could stop them, she whispered, "I don't think I've told anyone how lonely it gets sometimes." Her voice wasn't dramatic. It wasn't seeking pity. It was quiet, steady, like a truth that had been carried for years in silence. I felt my chest tighten, because I knew how much weight must have been behind those simple words. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, I let her continue. She shifted her gaze downward, tracing a faint line along the wood grain of the table with her finger. People think I like to keep to myself, that I prefer the quiet. And sometimes I do, but other times it feels as though the quiet has a way of swallowing me whole. Her vulnerability disarmed me. I had only ever seen her as composed, elegant, untouchable. To see her shoulders sink, to hear the faint tremor in her voice, it made her seem human in a way that drew me closer, not farther. "I don't see you that way," I said softly. "Not as distant, just reserved. There's a difference." Her eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time that night, I saw them shine with unshed emotion. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing my forearm, then resting there with a gentle weight. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it sent warmth coursing through me, grounding me in the present moment. "Thank you," she said. Two simple words, yet the sincerity in them carried more than gratitude. It felt like a confession, a relief, as if she hadn't expected understanding but found it here. I covered her hand with mine, lightly at first, uncertain if it was welcome. She didn't pull away. Her skin was warm beneath my palm, her touch steady but fragile, like she was giving me a piece of herself she rarely shared. The jazz record reached the end of its track, the soft crackle filling the room as the needle spun in silence. And still we sat there, hand against hand, saying nothing. I realized then that sometimes intimacy isn't built from grand declarations or dramatic moments. It's born in these quiet confessions, in the willingness to be seen. She smiled faintly, almost shyly, before slipping her hand back and tucking it against her lap. But the warmth remained, lingering between us like a promise unspoken. And I knew then, whatever this was becoming, it had already crossed into something neither of us could ignore. At some point, we drifted from the kitchen table into the living room. It wasn't a conscious decision. I don't even remember who suggested it. One moment we were sitting with cold cups of tea, and the next I was following her into the softer glow of the sitting area, where the air felt quieter, more intimate. The couch was wide enough to leave space between us, but not so wide that I could ignore her nearness. I sat at one end, and she settled a little closer than expected, a folded blanket draped across her lap. The silence between us was no longer the polite pause of conversation. It was something heavier, filled with awareness. She adjusted the blanket, and as she passed part of it toward me, her fingers grazed my hand. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a current through me that I couldn't shake. I glanced at her, and she was already looking at me, her eyes steady, as though she had felt it too. Neither of us said anything. The music from earlier had faded, leaving only the faint hum of the house at night, the creak of wood, the soft sigh of air through the vents. I became aware of every detail, the faint floral scent of her perfume, the warmth radiating from where her knee brushed lightly against mine, the delicate rise and fall of her breath. She leaned back into the couch, exhaling softly. "You know," she said, almost to herself, "I can't remember the last time I let someone stay this late." I swallowed, unsure if that was her way of telling me the night was nearly over. But when I turned, her expression was not one of dismissal. It was thoughtful, almost wistful, her lips curving in the smallest smile. "I'm glad you did," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Something flickered in her eyes, something unspoken but undeniably there. The distance I had always assumed was required between us, the years and the unspoken boundaries, felt thinner now. Our knees touched again, not by accident this time, but because neither of us moved away. I let the contact linger, the warmth of it grounding me. She shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing mine. The world outside her walls seemed to vanish, leaving only this moment, the quiet gravity of being here together. I wanted to say something, to name what was growing between us, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I simply stayed close, letting the silence speak for me. Her hand moved then, resting gently against mine on the cushion. Not clasping, not holding, just resting there warm and steady. I turned my palm upward, inviting hers without a word, and when her fingers slipped into mine, It felt less like a choice and more like something inevitable. For a moment, neither of us breathed. The tension wasn't sharp or overwhelming. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy with the weight of something both of us had silently wanted. And in that stillness, I knew the night was no longer just about company. It was about connection, deep, undeniable, and waiting for what came next. We sat there for what felt like a long time, our hands resting together between us on the couch. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden rush of words or gestures, just the quiet certainty of touch, the warmth of her fingers threaded with mine. She shifted slightly, turning toward me. The lamplight caught her face, softening the lines around her eyes, making her expression almost fragile. For a moment, she studied me, as though searching for the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was hushed, almost hesitant. "I haven't had company like this in years," she said. The simplicity of it nearly undid me. Not because the words were grand or poetic, but because of how much they carried. I heard in them the years she had spent in quiet, the evenings alone in this room, the conversations left unspoken. And I realized how rare this moment was for her. Not just sharing space, but letting someone close enough to feel it. I didn't know what to say at first. A dozen responses crowded my mind, but none of them seemed enough. So instead, I shifted closer, letting my shoulder brush hers, letting my presence be the answer she might need. She leaned into me, then, slowly, as if testing whether the moment would hold. Her head came to rest against my shoulder, her hair brushing my jaw, soft and faintly scented with lavender. My arm lifted, hesitant, then settled around her, drawing her in gently. Her body relaxed against mine, and in that simple contact, I felt the weight of her loneliness and the trust she was offering me now. Her cheek pressed lightly against my chest, and I became aware of her breathing, slow, steady, like she was finding her rhythm again after years of silence. "I don't usually let anyone in like this," she murmured, her words muffled by the fabric of my shirt. I tilted my head slightly toward her, speaking low. "Then I'm honored you did." She smiled at that. A small curve of her lips, I felt more than I saw. My hand rested gently along her arm, tracing the faint line of her sleeve with my thumb. The texture of the fabric beneath my skin, the warmth of her body, so close. It all carried a tenderness that words could never quite reach. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything we weren't saying, of the possibilities we were both too careful to name. When she finally lifted her head to look at me, her eyes lingered on mine, searching, holding me in place. There was a softness there, yes, but also a quiet strength, like she had decided something for herself. I didn't move, didn't rush. I just stayed there, close enough for her to see in my eyes what I hadn't yet spoken aloud, that I wasn't here out of pity or curiosity or even chance. I was here because I wanted to be, and for the first time that evening, I think she truly believed it. The night had grown late without either of us noticing. The quiet hum of the house, the soft glow of the lamp, the steady rhythm of her breathing beside me. It all made time feel slower, as though we were suspended in a world that belonged only to us. But eventually, she drew in a long breath and let it out with a faint smile. "I should probably let you go," she said, though her voice didn't sound entirely convinced. I nodded, though a part of me wished I could stay in that moment forever. Slowly, I loosened my arm from around her, and she sat up straighter, her fingers brushing mine as she shifted. That simple, fleeting contact was enough to keep the warmth alive between us. We rose from the couch together, and I followed her toward the front door. The soft creak of the floorboards beneath our steps echoed in the quiet, each one feeling like a small reminder that the night was drawing to a close. At the door, she paused. Her hand rested lightly on the knob, but she didn't turn it. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between gratitude and hesitation. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying, for listening, for being here." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she hadn't said. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I managed a steady smile. "Thank you for inviting me in. I meant it when I said I'm glad you did. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for my hand, her fingers curling gently around mine. The touch was warm, tender, lingering. I squeezed back, holding her hand with a quiet reverence, as though it were something delicate I didn't want to break. Her eyes met mine then, steady and searching. For a heartbeat, it felt like we were on the edge of something neither of us was ready to name, but both of us wanted to acknowledge. Finally, she let out a soft laugh, breaking the intensity without diminishing it. "You'll come by again, won't you?" I smiled. "If you'll have me." Her hand squeezed mine once more before slipping free. "I think I'd like that." I stepped outside into the cool night air, but even as the door closed gently behind me, I could still feel the warmth of her hand in mine, the quiet steadiness of her presence lingering like a soft echo. As I walked back toward my own door, the world felt different, lighter, fuller. The night hadn't ended with grand declarations or promises, but with something better, a quiet, unspoken understanding that this wasn't the end at all. It was only the beginning of something rare, something worth holding on to, and with every step, I found myself smiling, already knowing I would return.